It's my privilege to introduce Yasser Munif. He's a professor of sociology at Emerson College up in Boston. And he's also active with the, let's see the coalition's name, the Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution.
So I'm also a member of the Alliance of Middle Eastern and North African Socialists, and the Alliance works on supporting the revolts in the entire Arab world in the Middle East, and I think this is very important. What we have in the Arab world in the Middle East is a wave of protests that started in 2009 with Iran and has been going on. And I think it's important to think about the Arab revolts as a long process. It's not a number of months, it's not a number of weeks, it's in the years, maybe decades. And we see eruption. Every few years we see a new eruption, most recently with Sudan and with Algeria. And I think this is going to go on for a while. What we are seeing is the demise of the dictatorial order. And there is no going back. I think that the Arab people, the people in the Middle East and North Africa have burst a bubble and there is no going back. And this is why we see so much violence from the Arab regimes. Syria, one thing I will say just to, as a continuation of what Sina mentioned, which is the different groups and coalitions that are working against war in the US, and I think they have become monsters for one simple reason. They have a tendency to focus only on American wars in the Middle East, and they completely forget what those Arab dictators are doing to their population. If you look at Syria, for example, 90% of those who were killed in Syria were killed by the Syrian regime, not by the US bombs, not by ISIS, not by Al-Qaeda, not by the opposition. And this is important to keep in mind. If we are really serious about building a large coalition, anti-war coalition, we have to think about ways to think from the standpoint of the people who are struggling on the ground and not just dismiss them, ignore them, and just be Americanocentric and think about our own wars, which is egoistic. I mean, even for leftists, to think about war as an evil, as just emanating from the US is very simplistic, very one-dimensional. Arab dictators and dictators in the Middle East are extremely violent, and they are causing the deaths of people in Syria and Egypt and elsewhere. The other thing I would say is one of the slogans we came up with in 2002 when the US was preparing for the war against Iraq was no war, no dictatorships in plural. And we got heat from both sides. People who were saying you are delusional, you have to concentrate on the war against and formulate slogans against the US and so on. And those who were viewing the other side were trying to liberate Iraq with American tanks and so on. And I think this is an important slogans when you think about the Middle East: no wars and no dictatorships. So Syria, one of the most important slogans that Riyad al-Turk came up with, one of the important prisoners, political prisoners, he spent 19 years in prison, I think, was that he called Syria the kingdom of silence. And the Syrian regime came to power in 1963 with the Ba'ath, and then in 1970 with Assad, when he was able to put all his opponents in prison. And was able to impose that, politics of fear and politics of silence. You can't say anything against the regime. There are multiple branches of security that will silence anyone, would kill, torture, kidnap, and put in prison anyone who dare to oppose the regime. And what happened in 2011 is breaking that silence. And since 2011 up until now, the regime has been trying to reimpose that silence. And this is why we see so much violence and so much death. And I've been writing a book about Syria, and one of the entry points, I think, to understand what's happening in Syria is to think about it not just about the geopolitics and Iran interference and US and Russia and so on, but rather about, think about the politics of death and the politics of life. And this is the topic of my presentation, to think about Syria and those two forces, the people who are trying to, live and create livable, spaces and livable cities and create institutions that, support their communities and their livelihood, and the Syrian regime who are trying to kill them. So can we go to the second? This is from 1492. Leave, convert or die, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, to the Jews of Spain. But ISIS used it in 2014 against the Christian, leave, convert or die. And I think to a certain extent the Syrian regime has used it against the Syrian population. In the context of Aleppo, which is the focus of my talk, either leave, and when the war on Aleppo started, there were approximately 1.5 million people in East Aleppo, which was controlled by the opposition. When Aleppo was taken back by the Syrian regime, there were a little bit more than 100,000. So completely displaced the population. Leave. Convert, not necessarily in the sense of religion, but rather in the sense of Assadism. You have to embrace, Assad, and go back to this kingdom of silence. There is a French saying which is the silence of the slippers, the slippers in the household, is more dangerous than the boots of the military. And the Syrian regime was able to silence a large part of the Syrian population. Because of fear, people were not necessarily outspoken. They didn't speak against the Syrian regime. And so that's the meaning of convert, go back to the silence and die. A very large number of people died in Aleppo, just to take that example. Can we go to the... So this is a map of Aleppo back in 2013. Yeah, so these are the regime positions in orange. This is East Aleppo, which was controlled by the opposition. And here are the Kurdish area in yellow. What's interesting are those 2 points. This is the citadel of Aleppo, and this is here the Ottoman barracks from the 19th century. And so what I want to show is how space was utilized and deployed by the Syrian regime as weapons of mass destruction against the population. The next map is from the 1840s. This is an Ottoman map. And here you can see the Ottoman barrack, which was built around 1840 and was used again by the Syrian regime. There was a riot in 1850 between the people who lived in East Aleppo, which are the poor and the Bedouins, and the Ottoman military, who were also poor. And they rioted against the rich population in Western Aleppo. And the Western population moved to further west. And you're going to see that 150 years later with the map that was put in place between opposition and the Syrian regime. The western part of the city is the rich part. The eastern part of the city is the poor part. This is from 1982. There was, or 1980, I should say, there was a revolt in Aleppo, and it was crushed very, very violently by the Syrian regime. Again, here you can see the citadel, and those are the rebellious regions. They're very poor, and they are also mostly informal housing. And that's going to be one of the ways the Syrian regime is going to control the city. The presentation is about how space was utilized by the Syrian regime, and one of the things I wanted to show is the different strategies used by the Syrian regime, spatial strategies used by the Syrian regime to control the city. One of those were the horizontal power and the vertical power. The horizontal power is everything that happens on the horizontal plane, meaning the mobile militias who go around and terrorize the population, arrest people, kidnap them, put them in prison. And you're going to see the different tribes that were working for the Syrian regime in stopping people and putting them in prison. And then you have the military branches, the military bases all around the city that the Syrian regime has put because of the rebellion, but also what he inherited from the French mandate and the Ottoman, as I mentioned before. And so he segmented the city, and he sent his militias and the tribes to arrest people. And then you have the vertical power. What do we mean by the vertical power? This is all the, the sky power and the air power, the dropping of the barrel bombs, but also all the high structure and the high building, the tallest buildings. There is a map of the tallest buildings in Aleppo, and they're all in Western Aleppo. You can see the citadel, which was controlled by the Syrian regime. You can see the mosques, the highest or the tallest mosque, which were controlled by the Syrian regime. The luxurious hotels, which were also controlled by the Syrian regime. And the Syrian regime put snipers on all these. And they had a very clear view on what was happening in Eastern Aleppo. According to the Syrian American Medical Society, 30% of those who were killed in Aleppo were killed by snipers. The Syrian regime put around 100 snipers on the citadel, and it was completely impossible for the opposition to take it. They killed many people with the snipers. And so what's interesting is you can see, if you look at those tallest buildings, they are either mosques, so the state-sponsored religion. The Syrian regime built a number of mosques to show that they're Alawite Shia, but they still care for religion. And they were building all these mosques for the Sunni in the city. Aleppo is a very Sunni city. And so those mosques were used by the snipers to kill the population in Eastern Aleppo. Then you have the luxurious hotels. And this is the second group that was allied to the Syrian regime. All the capitalists, the bourgeois, that the Syrian regime was allowing to build all these luxurious hotels. And you can see how the snipers were positioned on in those luxurious hotels. Thirdly, you can see all the old structures in the city, meaning the citadel and the barrack, the Ottoman barracks and so on, and they were weaponized and utilized against Eastern Aleppo. And finally, you can see the barrel bombs, which were extremely lethal in Eastern Aleppo. They destroyed a major part of Aleppo. And what's one of the interesting things about the strategy of the regime is that they were already thinking about reconstruction. And so one of the things they were, and you can see that this is not specific to the Syrian regime. I think it was done here in the US and it's done everywhere. How they were destroying entire neighborhood, an entire neighborhood with informal housing, neighborhood that the neoliberal class and the capitalist class wanted to appropriate the land and build big project on them. And so those were the most affected by the barrel bombs. They were completely destroyed, and therefore the regime was destroying in order to redevelop and rebuild. And that was in their mind, especially in 2015 and 2016, completely eradicating entire neighborhood so that someone was asked the Syrian regime that they wanted this land or that land to develop a project, a luxurious hotel or a mall and so on. And those were some of the most affected neighborhoods. So they were completely erased from the map, and now there are a number of people who are bidding, the Russian and the Iranian and the Syrian capitalist class on some of those neighborhoods. So what I wanted to show is how the Syrian regime weaponized demographics, meaning poor against rich, different ethnic groups, different tribes, different ethnicities and sects against each other. And then what I mentioned, the horizontal power and the vertical power, what was happening on the ground, but also what was happening, with it. So it's not an understatement to say that, it was a war between the poor and the wealthy. Here you can see a map of the informal housing in pink. So all these areas are informal housing, and this is the affluent housing. This is the old. The Syrian regime also neutralized the Palestinian, which is very interesting because in Damascus it wasn't able to do so. It neutralized the two camps in Aleppo, Nayrab and Handarat. It did so by kidnapping a bus of Palestinian fighters and killed them. And there was a lot of confusion. It wasn't clear who killed the Palestinian. 14 people were killed. And it turned completely Al-Nayrab camp and then Handarat against the rebellion. There were protests in the camps, and very quickly they turned against the opposition. In 2015, when the opposition liberated Idlib, they found pictures of some of those people who were killed, tortured in the security branch inside the city of Idlib, and they knew that there was a proof. I mean, most people knew in the opposition that the regime did it, but they had the proof that the regime did it with pictures. It was too late, obviously. Here is the Kurdish areas, and by the way, some of those Kurds were displaced by the Syrian regime in the 1960s and 70s. The Syrian regime was trying to create an Arab belt around the Turkish border, was trying to displace and remove the Kurds from those regions because it was afraid that they would build a Kurdish nation with Iran and Iraq and Turkey. So it was removing all those Kurds from those regions, and some of them ended in Aleppo. And the Kurds, I mean, it's a complex story, but they were neutral and sometimes. But at the end, in 2015 and 16, they played a major role in helping the regime to take back Aleppo. Those are the Christian areas, and by the way, many of those people moved here in 1850, 1860. So 160 years later, the Syrian regime weaponized them against mostly Sunni areas here. And so the Syrian regime created Armenian and Christian militias to fight against the Sunni. And so what I'm trying to say here is how the Syrian regime weaponized all the demographics of the city against the revolution. And it's specific to Aleppo, but you can find traces of that in other places. Here are the tribe, the famous Al-Birri tribe, which became one of the most violent militias in Aleppo. And they were in the old city here and in Salhin in here. And so they were part of the mobile militias, arresting people and killing them, putting them in prison. Some people say that Al-Birri tribe had 5,000 people, and they were transformed into a militia. So the other thing that the Syrian regime did was the weaponization of the medical field. It attacked medical facilities and hospitals and the white helmets and so on. And this is very effective from the standpoint of the Syrian regime, because when you kill, there is actually one of the generals said, when you kill a fighter, you just kill a fighter. When you kill a doctor, you prevent that doctor from providing help to hundreds or thousands of fighters. So the Syrian regime understood the strategic importance of the medical field, and it was targeted. And right now it's being targeted in Idlib. It also targeted the bakeries. And again, this idea of targeting any source of life, politics of life and politics of death, in direct confrontation in Aleppo and elsewhere. This is one of the most lethal checkpoints in Aleppo. And it was targeted by the snipers every day. And some people had to cross the checkpoint to get bread and to see relatives and to go to work and so on. And one of the things that the snipers did was, it was very vicious. Sometimes they played game. as snipers. And so, for example, the doctor would say that in the morning, if they saw a pregnant woman being shot in her belly, they knew that it's going to be an entire day of pregnant women being shot, and that was, one of their bets. Or, for example, trying to kill 2 people with 1 bullet. So that was, another form of enjoyment or entertainment for the snipers, targeting people crossing that checkpoint. This is the vertical power I was talking about. So this is a hotel here, and this is the city hall, and they were both used by snipers, and they have a very good view of the city. Yeah, so all the snipers, those are all the tallest buildings. Again, it overlaps completely with the Syrian regime region. This is the opposition, this is the Syrian regime. And so there are all sorts of buildings. You have mosques, you have the city hall, you have luxurious hotels, and they were completely controlled by the Syrian regime. And so they had like complete control over the vertical power, what is called the vertical power. And you have basically here 4 snipers positions. And you can see the kind of view that they had. They completely paralyzed the opposition areas, and they had a complete view of the opposition. This is this was called the Tahrir Square of Aleppo. This is the region that people were trying to reach and were never able to. They were able to once or twice, but they were removed by the Syrian regime very quickly. The Syrian regime was very fearful that something like Cairo might happen, and so they were preventing people from reaching that region. This is the consequence of barrel bombs and the asymmetrical destruction of Aleppo. Again, there is almost overlap between the almost intact regions of the Syrian regime. And by the way, those are maps from the UN study group, and those are the affected areas of the opposition. The orange ones are the most affected, and the yellow are less affected. And here are the strikes against hospitals, almost completely in the opposition region. And so what happened as a result is that most of the life in Aleppo, or a good chunk of the life in Aleppo, moved to the underground. And people started moving their activities. They created underground playground, movie centers, schools, cultural centers, libraries, medical centers, and so on, all underground. And so there are all these striking, shocking pictures of destructions and rubbles and ruins, on the level of the ground. And then you go underground, and there is entire life. So here you have some of the tunnels that were dug by the opposition. Some of them were used for military purposes. Others were used to create life beneath the ground. And the last picture I want to show is this is hospitals and different institutions. The last picture is, I think, symbolic and telling. It's a crater that was. Can we go to? I think this is a representative of what I was trying to convey, the confrontation between the politics of death and the politics of life. Here you can see a crater created by a barrel bomb, and it was transformed into a swimming pool or a pond where kids were swimming. Thank you. So the Syrian regime was able to take back the city in 2016, end of 2016. As I mentioned, the Syrian regime was concentrating its forces on Aleppo and Damascus, the 2 major cities in Syria. And at some point, it was thinking that if there is segmentation or fragmentation of the territory, at least it would have those 2 major cities. Since then, there's been protest by the loyal pro-Assad people because nothing has been resolved. There is a lot of unemployment. People don't have access to food. There is shortages of fuel and bread. The militias are roaming the city and looting and taking over houses. And there is the reconstruction, between quotation mark. I mean, the language is just like lethal. When they talk about reconstruction, what they mean is looting and taking over entire neighborhood, displacing people and preventing them from coming back, taking their property and selling it to entrepreneurial Aleppan who were loyal to the Syrian regime and so on. So there is a lot of discontent. People are very upset, and I think this is why it's important to think about the revolt as a long process. And I think there will be a break for some time, and there will be the opposition is to a certain extent weakened, but there will be a revival of the revolt. We've seen that in the south, we've seen that in the north, we've seen that in Aleppo. In Dar'a, there were protests. I mean, the city was taken back by the regime. People know the violence of the Syrian regime. It knows that it has imposed death on an industrial scale in the prison, and yet they were not scared to go again and protest and bring the flag of the Syrian revolution and so on and so forth. So I think what is really important right now is to prevent the Syrian regime from reimposing that silence. That Syria shouldn't go back to the kingdom of silence. And one of the important things is not to think just about what is happening on the ground, but also what is happening at the level of discourse, meaning that we should break the siege around the idea that the revolution is over, the revolution has been defeated, and so on, and build alliances, raise awareness, tell people that this is not over, tell people that what's happening in Syria is connected to what's happening in Sudan and Algeria. And there is an order that is over, and people need our support. But we need a different type of anti-war movement. The anti-war movement that many people are talked about has become a monster. They only care about the US wars, and they don't pay enough attention to the violence of the Arab regime, to the Arab dictators, which is the source of most of the violence in the region.